Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one, and it's on a topic that's not often discussed. It has to do with your drop shots and how important your drop shot leader length is. This is something that oftentimes goes completely overlooked. A lot of anglers just set their drop shot at 12 inches. That's what they make it every time. And I assure you, if that's the case, there are times when you're really costing yourself some bites. This is a topic I've gotten a lot of questions on regarding what I like to use with my leader length. And honestly, there is no specific answer. I've got a set leader length that I generally might start with in a lot of circumstances. That's anywhere from, I'll say, 8 to 16 inches. But the reality is, in some cases, I go with a drop shot leader length of 2 inches. And I've gone with leader lengths as long as 6 feet. So it's one of those things where I've got a lot of very specific circumstances that if that's what I'm fishing, I will go with a short or long leader. So I want to share that with you. I want to walk you through some different scenarios, some different things that you might want to think about next time you're on the water using a drop shot. And hopefully, this answers the questions that I've gotten from a multitude of viewers regarding drop shot leader length. Um, you know, I've got a couple of stories I want to share. The first has to do with one of the first times I ever used a drop shot. I was out fishing Lake Geneva. If anyone is familiar with this is probably 25 years ago at this point, right? Kind of right when the drop shot started getting a lot of popularity. And if anyone is familiar with Lake Geneva, there is a lot of grass in that lake. And I was throwing a drop shot in the grass because I remembered reading an article in Bassmaster magazine about it. And I kept getting hung up. And I was like, well, this is ridiculous. I've got my standard 12-inch leader and I'm getting stuck in the grass, but Bassmaster was telling me to fish it in the grass, and I just wasn't getting any luck. So I ended up going with a much longer leader. I think I went with like a 4 foot leader because in my head, I'm like, well, if I fish this in the grass, my weight's going to go down. The weeds are only a couple of feet off the bottom. Therefore, my bait will be above the grass. And when I did that, I instantly went from catching nothing to having an amazing day on the water. Probably my best day I've ever had on Lake Geneva. And since that time, I remember, well, I mean, I won't say since that time, but for like the next year, my standard leader length was like 3 feet. And I had a lot of luck, but there were a lot of times where I just did not get bit. If I fished grass, generally I did okay. But if I was fishing just bare bottom or rock, other areas, I didn't get bit. So what that since has done is given me the experience and knowledge to know that there are differences in leader lengths for a specific time and place. I've got other circumstances fishing on areas with current where if I was using a long leader length, I was not getting bit. But as soon as I went to a shorter leader length, and when I mean shorter, I'm talking a couple inches, it was like night and day difference. So there's times and places for each. The first thing I want to point out has to do with the cast length that you make as well as the depth of water you're fishing. The most important thing that you need to recognize when fishing a drop shot is the angle of your line changes the height of your bait. Meaning, if you make an extremely long cast, that cast will keep your line at a more horizontal angle in the water. Meaning, if you've got a 1 foot leader and your line is very horizontal to the boat, your weight will be on the bottom. And if you're a foot away, your bait may only be 2 inches off the bottom. Now, if you made a shorter cast, your angle from the rod to your weight may be more vertical, and therefore the same leader length with a shorter cast may actually have your bait 6 inches off the bottom. Now, the same goes for depth of water you're fishing. So if you're fishing, say, in 5 feet of water on a normal cast of, say, 70 feet, your bait may only be a couple inches off. But if you're fishing, say, 25 feet of water, your bait's going to be much more vertical and therefore closer to being roughly the 12 inches that your leader length is. If you're fishing vertical under the boat, then for sure your bait is going to be the length of your leader length off the bottom. So you need to recognize how deep do you or how far off the bottom do you actually want your bait? In some instances, I've fished for bedfish that may only be in 2 feet of water, and I'm throwing a 6 foot leader because I want my bait about a foot off the bottom. But because it's so shallow and I'm trying to stay a ways away from the bedfish, I need to put my weight 6 feet past the bed to get my bait that far off the bottom. And it works just fine. But I need to recognize that if I want my bait coming off the bottom, I need a longer leader if I'm fishing super shallow water. So that's the first thing that you have to be aware of. The second thing is you need to recognize what you're trying to mimic. If you're trying to mimic bait fish that are a little bit higher off the bottom, obviously you need to go with a longer leader. If you're trying to mimic gobies or crayfish, you want a much shorter leader length. On the Great Lakes, for example, where there's a bunch of gobies, a lot of times your leader length is only going to be 4 to 6, maybe 8 inches because those gobies just skip around on rocks, and that's the primary forage fish for the bass. If you're trying to mimic crayfish, same thing. Those crayfish should not necessarily be suspended high up with a long leader length. You're fishing fish that are feeding on prey that are right on the bottom. So you want to recognize that. If you're fishing schooling fish that may be chasing shad, you may want to go with a much longer leader. So that's the second thing. The third thing I want to point out is a general rule of thumb is the dirtier the water, the shorter your leader length. In dirty water, fish tend to hold tighter to cover. So if you're fishing in 10 foot of water and there's a stump, the fish are probably going to be tight to the bottom, tight to that stump. And therefore, a shorter leader length keeps your bait closer to your weight, which is what's on the bottom, and therefore closer to the fish. Now, if you're talking about clear water, generally speaking, that just kind of goes wherever in terms of, like I was saying, what you're fishing, structure you're fishing, bait fish you're fishing. You could fish a 10-foot leader in gin clear water, or you could fish a 2-inch leader in gin clear water. But as a rule of thumb, the dirtier your water gets, the shorter your leader should end up being. The next thing I want to point out is the cover you're fishing. Now, like I mentioned in the story I gave you about fishing Lake Geneva, if you're fishing grass, generally speaking, I think you're much better off going with a longer leader length. So if you're on a place like Lake Gunnersville that has a ton of sandgrass can grow to be 2, 3 feet off the bottom. It's not uncommon for me to fish a 4 or 5 foot leader there because I want my bait to be just above the top of that sandgrass. Sandgrass grows pretty evenly in terms of height. So if you can get the right depth leader, you can keep your bait above it. The same thing goes for a lot of times in the springtime. If you've got new grass growth that's maybe 6 inches or a foot off the bottom, a 2, 3 foot leader is going to keep your bait right above the top of it, which is where the fish are going to be able to find your bait, and you're going to keep it out of the grass. A lot of people don't realize how good a drop shot can be in grass. And the one thing I'll point out with that too is you might want to go with a Texas rig bait just so that your hook is not necessarily always getting caught in the grass. And you probably want to go with more of a cylinder shaped drop shot weight just because that will fall in and out of the grass much better than a round shape or a bell shaped sinker. But so grass, I always go with a longer leader. Now to counter that, if I'm fishing, say, rock, a lot of times I go with a shorter leader because the fish that are hanging out around rock are generally tighter to that rock, and I want my bait closer to the bottom. Now, that's not always the case, but it generally tends to go that way. A lot of times, if I'm fishing rock, it's off colored water too. Maybe in the springtime, if you've got those rocks heating up, that's just going to be the same sort of area I'd throw it. So I generally like a shorter leader when we're talking about that. A couple other time periods when I think you're really good going with a short leader is during a mayfly hatch. Now, mayfly hatches, a lot of people think of fish slurping them off the surface, but in reality, they're eating a lot more as they're coming out of the mud. And from that standpoint, I'll go with a 2 or 3 inch leader with a small bait trying to mimic the mayfly hatch, and I have much better success with a very short leader versus a standard 12-inch or longer leader. A 2-inch leader is one of those things that I love to use during a mayfly hatch. When you're talking about largemouth, I generally feel like largemouth prefer a shorter leader as well. I'm going to be, if I'm not fishing around grass or an instance where I need a longer leader, if I'm just, say, fishing a ledge, I generally feel like I do better with a shorter leader, so 14 inches or less for largemouth But if we're talking about spotted bass or smallmouth, that's when a lot of times if I'm fishing those same areas or big flats, a lot of times I'll go with a lot longer leader. They tend to prefer baits above their head, and therefore a longer leader will help you generate strikes in those situations. Uh, Fishing current is another example where I definitely think you want to fish a short leader. If I'm fishing current, generally I'm fishing anything from a 2 to an 8-inch leader. And the reason for that is two things. Generally, your rivers are going to be more off colored, so it's dirtier water. But more importantly, the fish are almost always going to be holding in eddies. So whether it's a tiny eddy behind a baseball sized rock or a sand drop, the point here is the current wants to sweep your bait downriver. The fish are holding tight to cover. Therefore, when your weight comes by, you want your bait closer to that eddy or to that area where the fish are holding. On rivers, especially fast current rivers, the further your bait is away from the fish, the less likely they are to chase. They don't want to come out of their eddies. They'd much rather have something come right by their face that they know they can get for the energy that they're going to expel. So a short leader keeps you in the strike zone anytime you're talking about fishing rivers and current. So I generally always go with a much shorter leader. Plus, the rivers probably got more off-colored water. The last scenario I want to share with you has to do with steep break lines. So if I'm fishing a steep break line, say on a point or a hump, or just a straight break line, maybe on the outside of a flat, I generally like to go with a longer leader. That's another good example of when I might be fishing, say, a 2-foot leader or longer. Just because if you have a break line that drops straight off, generally, you're dragging across the top, therefore your bait's only that far off. But when your weight hits that drop off, the weight's going to want to pull your bait straight down. And from that standpoint, I like to have a little bit more separation so that when it's falling, it's a little further away from my weight. I feel like I generate more strikes from fish if my weight is further away from my bait. If my weight and my bait are say 6 inches apart as it's almost free falling down that ledge, I get a lot more weight strikes, meaning the fish eat my weight, and I feel like I don't generate as many strikes just because my bait doesn't. When it comes over that tip, it's almost like it just gets pulled right down versus having a little bit more slack in the line to kind of move a little bit better on the fall. It seems to generate more strikes for me, so it's if I'm fishing clear water bodies, a lot of times I'll go with a 3-foot leader if I'm fishing a steep break line, regardless of whether it's off a flat or a point or a hump. It just seems to generate more strikes for me. So those are some scenarios. The key here really comes down to recognizing that a 12-inch leader or whatever a standard leader is for you may be great in some circumstances, but it's not always the best thing. You should be changing leader length based on the situations that you're fishing. In some cases, like I said, a 2-inch leader will really outproduce a 12-inch leader or 2-foot or 3-foot leader. In other instances, a 3, 4, 5-foot leader will dramatically outproduce a short leader. So it's something that if you're a drop shot fisherman or want to start drop shotting, don't just think, okay, this is the leader length I go with. Like I know a lot of people that will start with a 12-inch leader and maybe they break a couple weights off and they just keep going shorter as it goes. And I've seen a lot of instances where people end up fishing with, they start with a 14-inch leader and they end up with like a 6-inch leader, and their bites dropped as they got with a shorter leader. And it was just because they didn't want to retie and go back to the longer leader that they started with. So don't let laziness cost you a few bites when fishing a drop shot because the length of your leader really does matter. So hopefully this answers a lot of the questions that I've gotten regarding leader length. It is something to pay attention to. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow for you.